So for our session today, we'll be focusing on the first 5 chapters of Second Samuel, our reading for this week. We'll also at the end look ahead a little bit to chapters 6 and 7. Just so much is happening, and as we look to our readings next week, there's so much happening. So we're gonna have a little sneak peek of some of what we'll be reading. So the first 4 chapters of Samuel, as you all probably noticed, are organized around 3 accounts of David's response to the death of his enemies. So for the first, we have an Amalekite man who falsely claims to have killed Saul himself. At least Robert Alter's gloss on this is that he probably was scavenging among the corpses in the battlefield and saw Saul there with his crown and his other regalia, and used this as an opportunity to make a quick buck or to earn favor with David. So David's response to this Amalekite man, far from being joyful at being given Saul's diadem and golden bands, kills the messenger, and then rends his garments, keens, fasts, and weeps for the deaths of Jonathan and Saul. And he goes as far as to bless the people who rescued Saul's body from the battlefield and buried him properly. We then get the text of David's sung lament, where he describes Saul, the man who sought his death relentlessly. He calls him beloved and dear, and his son Jonathan, his brother, whose wondrous love he praises. David then goes up to Hebron with his family, the place where the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, along with their wives Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, are buried there in Hebron. It is here that David is anointed king by the men of Judah. His anointing inaugurates a divided kingdom, with Saul's son being made puppet king over an alliance of northern tribes by Saul's commander Abner, who then takes center stage in the story among the northern tribes. As you all remember, a civil war ensues with David and his men versus Abner and his men. This starts out as kind of a staged battle, sort of like a joust, but then quickly erupts into unstaged violence. And the absurdity of this war is captured in an exchange between David's commander, Joab, and Saul's former commander, Abner. So, and it starts with Joab's son in the midst of this staged battle, which is supposed to be one-to-one combat. Joab's son kind of breaks formation and relentlessly pursues Abner in battle. And Abner, recognizing what would happen if he killed his rival commander's son, pleads with Joab's son to desist. The son refuses, and Abner kills his son, Joab's son, in an act of self-defense on the battlefield. Joab then pursues Abner till the day's end, seeking to avenge his son's death, leading Abner to call out as the sun is setting, "Must the sword endure forever? You surely know that it will be bitterness to the end. And how long will you not say to the troops to turn back from their brothers?" And Joab shrewdly retorts to the effect of, "Had you called it off this morning, none of this would have happened." There's this brief moment of recognition of what's happening here, that really this is brother battling against brother within the Israelite against Israelite. The fighting then halts for a minute, only to be pursued off of the battlefield. This brings us to the second example then of an encounter between David and the messenger who reports the death of an enemy or a supposed enemy. So Abner, after the conflict with Saul's son, goes to David to seek a peace treaty after some conflict. After a festive meal celebrating the truce, Abner, quote, goes in peace, only to find Joab, quote, lying in wait for him in a field outside the city gates. Joab kills Abner, quote, deceptively to avenge his son's death. And upon hearing this news, David once again weeps for his former enemy and leads all the people in lament. And amidst this lament, David describes himself using the Hebrew term rak, which means tender. And noteworthy, it's a term used in Genesis to describe the tenderness of animals that are being offered for ritual sacrifice, and also the tenderness of children. So David here says, "I'm so tender, essentially, who am I to be king with all of these hard men surrounding me?" And then the final example of Saul's encounter with the death of a former enemy, two of Saul's own former commanders kill Saul's son, who's now been anointed a puppet king over the northern tribes, while the son is sleeping in his own bed. These assassins bring his head to David, and David, far from celebrating, scolds the men for thinking they are bearers of good tidings, and kills them, or orders them to be killed. So these three episodes where David laments the deaths of his former enemies, and nonetheless with these images of a mangled body, with the parts of these assassins being hung up across the city along, and then the head of their victim being buried at the tail end of a civil war. So the situation, this carnage, in the context of civil war should remind us of the end of the book of Judges, which again, remember, actually came right before 1 Samuel. So it's against this familiar backdrop that we see the people again unify under the call for a king, the same way that we saw, the same pattern that we saw at the beginning of 1 Samuel, a kind of restart of this whole process. But this time it's a specific call for David to be their king and, quote, shepherd. And we are told that, quote, all the tribes of Israel come to David at Hebron, the storied place, and make a covenant with him, with language reminiscent of the early days in the Garden of Eden. They say, here we are, your bone and your flesh are we. In other words, the Israelites are saying something to the effect of, we recognize that we are one family and that we need a shepherd, and we need that shepherd to be you. God has willed it so. As that brings us to the end of chapter 4, where we're left with the image of a king who is constantly seeking to know the will of God. We're told in some chapters that he'll seek the wisdom of God, 3 or 4 times in quick succession. A man who mourns the death of his enemies, who is, quote, tender, and defies the clear expectations of someone in his position by not encouraging those who seek to perpetuate the cycles of blood, guilt, and revenge. But however, of course, this is only true in a limited way. David himself engages in killing in 2 of these cases as a punishment for killing an innocent man. And so maybe in our discussion, we can talk about that. So it is this David who's at the peak of his glory, who at God's instruction then goes to take the city of Jerusalem, and specifically the stronghold of Mount Zion. And we should remember from last week's discussion, or I think it was the week before, the setting of this mountain, which is also known as Mount Moriah, and its importance for several key moments in Israel's history. The first being Abraham's near sacrifice of his son Isaac, where he then sacrifices an animal instead, and also the encounter between Abraham and the priest king Melchizedek. And so it's here on Mount Zion where David will unite the roles of priest and king that we saw so tortuously divided in the case of Saul and Samuel. So he'll become a royal priest just as Melchizedek was, and as was promised to Abraham. And so Paul captures the significance of this setting, which will only become more important to the David story, in his letter to the Hebrews. So I want to share this quote for us to get a sense of how this move, David establishing the city of David at Zion, fits into the broader scope of salvation history. So Paul writes, "For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of the trumpet," here referring to Mount Sinai in Exodus, "and a voice whose words made the hearers entreat that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, quote, if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that even Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to a judge who is God of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks more graciously than the blood of Abel." So here you can see, Paul drawing out just how important this movement from Mount Sinai to Mount Zion is, and how it inaugurates the path of a more gracious sacrifice of a festal gathering that, of course, is leading us to Christ. And so as we'll see in our reading for next week, especially, the establishment of the city or house of David in Jerusalem, specifically at Mount Zion, and David's decision to then move the Ark of the Covenant there, sets the stage for God's covenant with David, which we'll encounter in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is the major text of the Davidic covenant. So I have just some of that, some of those verses here, with the crux of the promise being, "In your house, David, in your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." And then David's reply. And it's noteworthy here to see, as we connect to the broader theme of covenant that has guided our reading this year, David's response to God, and specifically to this promise of the one to come, who is of the house of David. David calls this the law for man, or the Torah of mankind. So we can see that in the thread of, as we're on this mountain, again, seeing the relationship between what's happening here and the covenant at Sinai, that this is a covenant of the scale of Sinai as momentous, but in some sense, even greater than Sinai. And the reason for that being is this is a covenant that is made with man, and the word here is Adam, the Torah of Ha-Adam. So a covenant that's made for, or a promise that is for all, not just for the people of Israel. And so like I said, the content of this teaching, or this Torah, is the promise of a son of David, who will also be the son of God, as we'll see in 2 Samuel 7, who will be a Messiah of all people, and to use Paul's words, the mediator of that new covenant. So I'll go ahead and leave it there, actually, with a shorter presentation. Just open it up for discussion based off of anything there, or thoughts from folks reading.
Well, was David a precursor of Christ in the love your enemy, and that he ended up giving respect to Saul and Abner and the son of Saul, as even though they had been enemies, and people expected him to treat them like dead enemies. Instead, he respected their lives and made sure that they were remembered reverently. And just by coincidence today, I was reading the early chapters of the Dante's Inferno, and Dante puts David in limbo as one of the greats of the past that just didn't get a chance to live during Christ's period.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well, and thinking about what I'm invited to see in the episodes with the killing of Saul, the killing of Abner, and of Ish. How do you pronounce the name? Ish?
Boheth or something, the son of Saul.
So what's similar there, and then David's response to it. Yeah, like what am I invited to see? So certainly to what you were saying, Mary, that if the anti-kings of Israel, both in Judges and in Saul, were really good at killing their own, that seemed to be so we're invited to see that David not doing that, and then a distinction between this sort of the sense that those who do engage in that are punished, and we're supposed to see that as just, or at least that seems to be what we're invited to see. But I wonder, are we invited at all to see this as? I mean, obviously we have our own perspectives on that, but I wonder if we're invited at all to see that as sort of perpetuating that in a way, too.
So there you're talking about David's killing of the people who killed, that being the fun of love your enemies, but also punish those who don't. So
we're obviously like to see a distinction, but I wonder if that's or whether there's another perspective in there also.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking of that more as David being the authority figure, that those deaths were capital punishment by the authority rather than personal revenge.
Yeah, and I think there's something of that there for sure. If you think about the situations where he does and doesn't act in that manner. The first is with the person who claims to have killed Saul. There's the stipulation there about not touching the Lord's anointed. And so it seems like we're supposed to read that as, some sort of like you said, Mary, something like a state punishment, or at least, the justice for that crime of killing the Lord's anointed. But then in the second case with the Joab killing Abner, there's at least, even though that death was wrong, because we're invited to see even in the manner that Abner killed the son of Joab as an act of self-defense, where it's the son actually running up against, it's the force of his body running up against Abner's spear that causes his death. That even though that was wrong because of the circumstances of the death, there's still something about avenging one's own kin that maybe doesn't quite merit the death penalty in the schema of justice here. And then in the third case, killing an innocent man in his bed being, a kind of a more obvious injustice. So I think we're invited to see David's killing of those who perpetrated violence as distinct from the original acts. But nonetheless, it's troubling in the way how it puts them together in a way that it invites you to see their similarity, perhaps just as much as their difference. Any other thoughts on that sequence of events there? I know our reading really slowed down as we hit 2 Samuel because of that Chronicles material. So we have the time to really dive into smaller scenes.
Well, it does make me wonder, what the the higher, like there's some things that I think were outlined for us in the books of the law in Exodus and Deuteronomy about what merits what, but the sense of what merits guilt but not capital punishment, where it's still like the blood guilt is on his house and all of these curses to his house. And what is that? Are we being invited to? I don't know if I have a specific question there, but I realize that I'm maybe it's hard for me to get some of the nuances here because I'm not understanding what is supposed to be taken as like the baseline. And so therefore, what are the nuances of what goes, of what diverges from the baseline?
Yeah, I think at least the narrator here is really training our attention on what's expected of David and the divergences from what's expected there, specifically the celebration of the death of an enemy. But I don't know underneath that how to read the differences is more tricky.
Yeah.
And I don't know. From my reading that the story of Joab killing Abner while he's under David's protection, or it just sounds suspicious. In turn, and the way that they proclaim that David was innocent of this killing, I think methinks that doth protest too much. It seemed, I don't know. To me, it seems to run in the story that maybe David did have something to do with Abner's death. That Joab would, know that Abner is under David's protection and go ahead and kill him anyway. I don't know. It doesn't say that specifically, but it seems like the way the story is written, there's so many things where the way the story is written about David makes me very suspicious of what he actually did.
Well, yeah, it definitely in talking about how other people considered it and how his mourning came off. I don't know if I got that impression, but I definitely at least got the impression that this was a matter that was definitely debated, and that there was perhaps disagreement over, or else our attention wouldn't be drawn so much to what people thought about how David conducted himself and even his mourning and its authenticity.
But then you're saying that like this narrator or the redactor is in some way probably responding to a debate.
But yeah, it made me think
There.
that as I
Yeah.
read it, because it's drawing attention to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
A question I had, this is pretty different, but going to, when there's the split there, initially, so that David is the king of Judah and the Israel were the kingdoms that, the clans that made up Israel there following Saul, and then like his son. That why? Okay, I could see why Judah is called Judah there, because it's the tribe of Judah. But why is Israel chosen as the name for the whole amalgam of northern tribes? Because Israel is a name that all 12 tribes are derived from Israel. So I was wondering, why does that then come? And I know it arises again, like the north is Israel, and I just wonder why. I ask you.
Does anyone know?
I wondered that too.
Yeah.
And why is Judah so separate from the other tribes?
Well, in this case, there's a connection with David, but you mean in a different way?
Yeah, even if it wasn't, it was separate even before David rose to power. There was Judah and Israel, I think, from the beginning of the Samuel reading.
If I'm remembering correctly, I think part of that is we get some of that story in some of the earlier books here about whether they settled on what side of the river they settled on, and they have some, and there's a story about why that happened. So I think we get the sense that, geography is obviously a play, or at least between north and south, but also that the geographic features separate some of the tribes from the others.
But it's not a distinction of on either side of the Jordan, though.
It is in the book of Joshua and Judges. It's about there's those tribes that settle outside of the promised land, but we're given to know very strongly. But don't worry, they actually did fight too.
But the tribes of Israel will be on either side of the Jordan, right?
I think there's a few out on one side of the Jordan and most on the other.
Yeah, well, that's why that's why I was
Yeah.
thinking it was a different distinction.
Yeah.
No, I think most of them were on the west of the Jordan, and those three that includes the half tribe of someone are on the east, but that's not north and south. That's why
Yeah. No, I was really struck in this part again, just by the how the echoes, and especially as we're talking about violence, like the echoes here of the book of Judges that emerge in the middle of 2 Samuel here, that it's it seems like we're kind of restarting that whole call for a king process again. So I think just as a general pattern of reading, still stuck the sort of the tedium of the pattern that we trace throughout the Torah, which is God restarting again and again and again in salvation history. And so I think as I was reading here, where it seems like we're always going back to Genesis, now it seems like we're always going back to Judges to some extent as human violence proliferates.
But we're also going back to Moses, because usually punishment in the Samuel era is death or something, but suddenly the punishment is marks on your body and all the things that cancers and things that go back to the time when Moses was around, and those people were getting these kind of punishments. So, but it seems a little throwback to that era when you get boils and,
The curses.
yeah, that,
Wait, when you said things about,
I don't know if this-
versus,
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, please, Leah.
No, I was just kind of echoing a little bit what Harry said and kind of what I said last week. As I keep reading with David, I'm finding I have a difficult time connecting.
Yeah.
I said, you know, he is sort of an Odyssean character to me in some way. It's sort of, I can't put my hand on, I can't grab him. I can't understand him. I feel like I'm not being told enough. And I think there's an element of not, you know, I mean, why does this feel like something's not being revealed? And obviously he also takes the opportunity often to not tell the whole truth too, right? And so, you know, there's this strangeness about David. I see him as sort of this charismatic character rather than a character of depth. That's my experience as I'm reading him. So people like the fact that he sings great songs and he's, you know, he does these great deeds, but I find him difficult to connect with in, you know, as someone who is supposed to be iconic in scripture. I'm finding it very difficult as I'm going through these readings. I don't know what to do with that, so I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. Yeah, that comment, Leah. I think Robert Alter describes David as sort of veiled in silence. It's like, it's really noteworthy when he does speak, because most of the time he's just sort of like shrouded, like we can't quite see him. It's through a mist here. And I think, and he reflects on one of the reasons why we feel that, say, in a way we didn't feel about Jacob. Like we actually had far less of someone like Jacob's interior life. But I think with the earlier stories, we didn't feel that lack quite as acutely, in part because the stories themselves were written with less, like the other characters also weren't fleshed out. We didn't have a sense that, like the way, like if we compare, you know, Saul and David again, you know, the way we actually get a sense of like Saul's interior life, but we don't of David's, or the way we get Jonathan, a sense for Jonathan's interior life and the way we don't of David's. There's something striking about the contrast, even if compared to some of the other texts that we've read. It's not that striking that we know so little. I guess one thing that was helpful for me was, as I was going back through and reading the Psalms, to at least think about, like, in the tradition, these are all the words of David. And so thinking about that as revealing David's interior life, as the details and the nuance of David's relationship with God and what his interior prayer sounded like. That to me,
Yes, but I have a problem with that too, though, because that's the tradition. But even just reading the Psalms, it's clear that probably is retrojected in. And so I don't know I think that's the exterior life, but I don't see that as the interior life. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with just accepting something like that whole hog. Oh, they're all David's. Well, maybe not. And I don't think that reflects that. I mean, if anything, that reflects a very exteriorized understanding of him, not the interior. I don't believe that's the interior. I think there's something else that's being projected onto him. I think I think the fact that he is so unknowable in some way means that all of the projection of everybody's desires can be projected onto him, because it's like we can't see, he's opaque. And so I mean, we can, you know, if I have to sit here and accept that all of those are written by David, I can't. I don't believe that. I'm sorry. I just don't. I think that's a tradition, but I don't believe that's the reality. And so because of that, I don't believe we can say those are his interior feelings. That's my position.
Yeah.
That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Two thoughts. One, the interiority or the lack thereof. I mean, so with David, we may think, wait, there's something not here. But I think it's interesting with biblical characters in general. you don't even get enough to even think that you might have it, regardless of how important they are. Like Abraham, for example, like what's really going on in there? We're not told. What we're given is what he did. And sometimes, even if that's like a prayer, so you think like, oh, he had recourse to God in the situation. But I'm actually reminded, because of what Emma does of iconography here, where when you think of like, oh, John the Baptist or even Christ or something, like, you don't think like, oh yeah, that's what Jesus looked like. No, there are these certain exterior features that are symbolic of something that are the reason why you can tell that this is a David, that this is a John the Baptist, that this is a Mary and not a Mary Magdalene. And so I wonder though, is that, you could say that's a veiling, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that all that isn't what we would expect in sort of biographical writing, modern biographical writing, isn't there. Anyway, I don't necessarily feel cheated about that. But I would say, wait, one more thing though, is I think this relates. I was struck that, especially as you were talking, Leah, that there's this prominence on that word tender. And I was thinking, that is different. I don't know if this corresponds with the first thing I said, but there's a difference between saying he's like tender or sensitive and saying he's like deep. And you do see that, like, it's like, yeah, he seems like, no, I'm not going to take advantage of this person. No, I'm too sensitive to do that, kind of. But not that he would, yeah, but I think we all know from ourselves and maybe other people we consider sensitive. Sensitive people could do bad things. They just weren't particularly sensitive to that at the time. But there's still a human quality of sensitivity. So maybe he is a sensitive guy, but which is not to say he's not a sinful guy.
Well, and that could be a reason for opacity, right? Because there is what he has more tension potentially between what he does and what he thinks, or his emotional response to what he does, right? That's possible, I think, because I do think that that's true for people that have like a highly sensitive nature. But I still am disturbed by it. Again, this could be the desire of the writers to portray him as leader instead of as the person who was sensitive, if that makes any sense. And so then that creates the tension in the description, right? But because that's how I feel as I'm reading it. I keep feeling like it's not so much that you don't know him, but that the actions aren't flowing for me from what I don't know how to explain it. I won't even try. I don't know. I just find him a very hard character to respond to in the place he is supposed to be, both within Christian and just salvation history in general. I'm just finding him difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, and Leah, just to say one thing, mostly by way of clarification. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the Psalms, and like you, it's not, have a hard time taking for granted that all these Psalms are written by David, especially when, they refer to events that are clearly after David's reign, all this stuff. But I think it's interesting to think about that attribution to David as a response to to other people throughout salvation history, or throughout, the history of biblical reading, responding to that same sense, that same desire to know him, and in a way it's not met by the text itself. So I guess just to clarify, that's sort of more what I was trying to point at by pointing to the Psalms is, that attribution is plain.
That raises a question for me, and I can understand where Leah is coming from, because I struggle with David as well. And is it? I don't know enough about biblical theology to know anything about this, but is it reasonable to say that the writers of the Psalms, however many they were, attributed all these Psalms to David as though they wished that David had these thoughts and these feelings, because he is being lionized in the history of the Jewish people, because he was such a great king in their eyes. And as time passes, you tend to idealize those historical figures who were important to the establishment of their nation. Maybe that's what's going on. I could see that happening because we see it happen today with our own historical figures. People who love them tend to idealize them and actually put words in their mouth, things that they never said, but things that people thought they heard them say. I think that's just a historical phenomena when we idealize figures from the past. It just thinking out loud here.
Sounds like you're thinking of George Washington and the cherry tree. Maybe there's something there, but they also give some little details that really, show his tenderness. Like when he's negotiating with Abner about his, coming under his fold again. He said, "But first, can I have my first wife back, the one that was stolen from me, who I really liked, because a name like Michal." So he won't finish the treaty unless he gets his first wife back that was promised to him, but then taken away.
Or I think we'll see another example of that later when, with his, dancing before the tabernacle or before the Ark of the Covenant, where it's, is that inappropriate? And he says, I'm doing it for God. Like I'll play the fool for God, essentially, being his response there to that sort of ecstatic dancing. Yeah, Harry, were you going to jump in earlier too?
I think most of what I would have said, Leah and Mark have said in that I see this as a kind of political propaganda or political mythologizing, trying to justify the king. And yeah, I think Mary is exactly right. It's, we do that in America with George Washington, with Thomas Jefferson, with John Kennedy to a large extent. I mean, for the glory of the nation, perhaps, and the political power, writers emphasize their virtues and kind of gloss over, their weaknesses. I guess Jefferson would be a great example of that, with only fairly recently the attention paid on, his slave holding and his propagation of his family through slaves, things like that. I guess as I read, Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, I tend to think of them, I read them as scripture in some sense, but also as political propaganda.
Well, it's interesting to hear to at least also consider what, Robert Alter's take on this, and his gloss on this is also frequently about a kind of, he doesn't shy away from reading like political motivation into a figure like David, for example. But nonetheless, he makes the point frequently that if this is political propaganda, it's pretty bad political propaganda insofar as it reveals a lot of the weaknesses of the people who are supposed to be heroes here, as we'll soon see with David, with the story of Bathsheba, and as we've seen with every figure that we've had here, no one has been like a likable character who meets our standard for what a good leader is or a good follower of God, is maybe with the exception of Hannah.
I was thinking the same thing. It's it's interesting, and if so, the type of yes, I mean, so not to say that I would, imagine that those things are there in some way, but yeah, like, George Washington, the cherry tree is nothing compared to the sins of David or of Abraham, or, these are like the father, like the lack of faith of the father of faith, for example, like that would be like saying, like George Washington, who fought for the British a lot of the time, but he ended up on America's side. But no, you don't have that. He seems to mostly be a character of constancy. So I don't know. I think that it's a different breed of of propaganda if it's propaganda. And maybe it's the biblical one is significantly different.
Yeah, maybe the sociologist Robert Belloc advanced many decades ago the notion of American civil religion, and the fact that Americans have tended to interpret our history in biblical terms. Even I'm not sure if this is totally relevant, but there were many themes of George Washington as the new Moses, who was leading his people out of slavery, to George III, and of course Abraham Lincoln, especially after his death, was referred to as the new Jesus, who died to redeem America from the sin of slavery. And even the presidents were sometimes aware of that. If you read Lincoln's second inaugural address, it's probably the greatest religious sermon in American history, interpreting the Civil War as God's punishment on America for the sin of slavery. So I guess maybe I'm thinking of this in part because I've seen the Christian themes in America